The photograph arrived in an estate sale lot I'd purchased online, a box of wartime memorabilia from a deceased veteran's collection. Most of it was standard: medals, discharge papers, a few postcards from France. But at the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, I found a single photograph that made me pause. It showed 5 American soldiers sitting outside a farmhouse somewhere in France, dated on the back July 1944. The men looked relaxed, almost casual. One was lighting a cigarette. Another cleaned his rifle. A third smiled at the camera with the kind of tired relief that comes after surviving something difficult. The composition was ordinary, a moment of rest during the chaos of war. The kind of photograph that appeared in thousands of family albums. But something in the background caught my eye. Behind the soldiers, barely visible through the farmhouse window, was a figure, blurred by distance and the camera's depth of field, but distinctly human. A woman, standing motionless, watching. Her posture was wrong, too rigid, too still, and her hands, I had to use a magnifying glass to see clearly. Her hands appeared to be bound. I scanned the photograph at high resolution and zoomed in on the window. The woman was young, perhaps 20. Her hair was disheveled, her dress torn, and yes, her hands were definitely tied in front of her. Behind her, deeper in the shadows of the room, I could make out other figures. At least 3 more people, all standing in the same unnaturally still position. The soldiers in the foreground showed no awareness of what was happening inside the farmhouse. They sat with their backs to the window, oblivious or deliberately ignoring what was behind them. I felt cold dread settle in my stomach. This wasn't a photograph of soldiers resting. This was a photograph of soldiers resting while something terrible happened in the building behind them. I contacted the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, sending them the high-resolution scan. A researcher named Dr. Robert Chen called me back within hours. "Where did you get this?" His voice was tight. "Estate sale, from a veteran's collection." "Why?" "Because if this photograph shows what I think it shows, it's evidence of a war crime that was never documented." He asked me to send the original by secure courier. 3 days later, Dr. Chen called again. "We've analyzed it. The photograph is genuine, dated correctly to July 1944, taken somewhere in Normandy based on the architecture and landscape. The unit insignia visible on one soldier's sleeve identifies them as part of the 30th Infantry Division, which operated in that sector during that period." "And the woman in the window?" A long pause. "That's where it gets complicated. We showed the image to experts in wartime atrocities. The consensus is that this farmhouse was likely being used as a holding location for suspected collaborators or resistance members being interrogated. By Americans? Possibly. Or by French resistance forces operating alongside American units. In the chaos after D-Day, there were summary interrogations, accusations of collaboration, vigilante justice. Most of it went undocumented. The people in that room, were they prisoners? Almost certainly. Whether they were guilty of anything, we can't know. But the restraints, the positioning, the way they're being held. Dr. Chen's voice dropped. "This photograph captures something that wasn't supposed to be captured. A moment when the camera was pointed the wrong direction." "Or the right direction," I said quietly. "Yes, or the right direction." Dr. Chen connected me with a French historian named Isabelle Moreau, who specialized in the immediate post-liberation period in Normandy. We spoke by video call the following week. "This photograph is significant," she said, examining the image on her screen. "We know that in the summer of 1944, across liberated France, there were thousands of informal trials and executions. Women accused of collaboration, whether true or not, were publicly humiliated, beaten, killed. Most of it happened in the streets, but some happened in private, like in this farmhouse." "Exactly. The American soldiers in the foreground probably had no direct involvement. They were just resting. But the building they chose to rest against was being used for something else. And someone, the photographer, captured both realities in one frame." "Who took the photograph?" Isabel zoomed in on the soldiers. "Look at how they're positioned. They're not posing formally. This is candid, which means the photographer was probably another soldier, maybe documenting his unit informally. He pointed the camera at his friends and didn't notice or didn't care what was happening in the background. Or he noticed and photographed it deliberately. That's possible too. Some soldiers documented things they knew were wrong, kept evidence. Most of that evidence was never shared publicly because of the complications it would raise. I thought about the veteran whose estate I'd purchased. Had he been one of the soldiers in the photograph? Had he kept it as evidence? As guilt? Can we identify the woman in the window? I asked. Difficult. We'd need to know the exact location of the farmhouse, then cross-reference with local records of arrests, interrogations, or deaths from that period. Many of those records were destroyed or never existed in the first place. But it's possible? It's possible. Isabel agreed to help me investigate. Over the next month, we worked to identify the location. Using architectural details, landscape features, and the unit's movement records, we narrowed it down to a region near St. Lo, a town that had been heavily fought over during the Normandy campaign. Isabel contacted local historians and elderly residents who remembered the liberation. One name kept appearing in the responses: Madeleine Roussel. She had been 22 in July 1944. She had disappeared during the chaos following the American advance. Her family had searched for her for weeks. Her body was never found. But one witness, now deceased, had testified in the 1950s that Madeleine had been accused of collaboration, falsely, the witness believed, and taken to a farmhouse for questioning. She was never seen again. Isabel sent me a photograph of Madeleine taken before the war. A young woman with dark hair, wearing a summer dress, smiling at the camera. I compared it to the blurred figure in the farmhouse window. The resemblance was striking. I think we found her, Isabel said when we spoke next. And I think this photograph shows the last moments of her life. I stared at the image. The relaxed soldiers, the hidden woman, the terrible secret captured accidentally by a camera pointed the wrong way. What do we do now? I asked. We tell her story, Isabel said. So she's not just a blur in the background anymore. Working with Isabel, I began reconstructing the events of July 1944 in the region near St. Lo. The 30th Infantry Division had advanced through the area in mid-July, encountering fierce resistance, but eventually pushing German forces back. In the wake of their advance, French civilians emerged from hiding and chaos erupted. Accusations of collaboration flew everywhere. Anyone who had worked for Germans, traded with them, or even spoken to them became suspect. Women who'd had relationships with German soldiers, whether consensual or coerced, faced particularly brutal retribution. Isabel found testimony from a local priest who'd kept a private diary during this period. The entries were devastating. July 16, 1944, madness in the streets today. 3 women dragged from their homes and beaten publicly. One had her head shaved in the square while people cheered. I tried to intervene. They told me to mind my business or join her. July 18, 1944. More accusations, more violence. The Americans seem unwilling or unable to stop it. They say it's French justice. I say it's vengeance masquerading as justice. July 21, 1944. Madeleine Roussel has been taken. Her mother came to me weeping. They say Madeleine worked as a translator for the Germans. Her mother says she had no choice. They threatened to deport her family if she refused. No one will listen. The diary didn't mention what happened to Madeleine after she was taken, but another source did. Isabel discovered a post-war investigation file, part of French efforts to document collaboration and resistance, that included brief testimony from a man named Georges Moreau. I saw them take Madeleine to the Leclerc farm, the old stone farmhouse on the hill above St. Lo. There were Americans camped nearby, but they weren't involved. It was French resistance who took her. They said she needed to be questioned. I never saw her again. When I asked later, they said she'd confessed and been dealt with. I don't know what that meant. The Leclerc farm. I cross-referenced the location with the landscape visible in the photograph. The hill, the stone construction, the positioning of the windows. It matched. This was the farmhouse in the photograph. Now we need to understand who took this picture, I said to Isabel. We returned to the estate sale records. The veteran whose collection I'd purchased was named Thomas Garrett, a photographer's mate who'd served with the 30th Infantry Division. He'd died in 2019 at age 96. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, and his post-war career as a newspaper photographer. It noted that he'd documented the liberation of France with honesty and courage. I contacted his surviving daughter, Ellen Garrett Morrison, who lived in Oregon. "My father never talked much about the war," she said when we spoke by phone, "but he kept that box of photographs locked in his study. I went through it after he died and found, well, you bought some of it. The rest I kept." "Did he ever mention a photograph of soldiers outside a farmhouse?" A long pause. "He mentioned a photograph he wished he'd never taken. He said it haunted him." "Did he say why?" "Only that he'd pointed his camera one way and captured something else entirely. Something he couldn't unsee afterward." Ellen agreed to look through the remaining photographs her father had kept. 2 days later, she sent me scans of 3 more images. They were taken at the same farmhouse, moments before or after the photograph I had. The first showed the same soldiers, but from a different angle. In this one, you could see the farmhouse door partially open. A man stood in the doorway, French based on his clothing, holding what looked like a rifle. The second photograph showed 2 women being led from the farmhouse. Their hands were bound. Their faces showed terror. Behind them, more figures emerged from the building. The third photograph was the most damning. It showed one of the women kneeling in the dirt behind the farmhouse. A man stood over her with a pistol. The American soldiers were nowhere in the frame. This was happening away from their camp, out of sight. The woman's face was turned toward the camera. It was Madeleine Roussel. Ellen sent a note with the photographs. My father wrote on the back of one of these, "I documented what I saw. I didn't intervene. I've carried that shame my entire life. I felt sick looking at the images." Thomas Garrett had witnessed an execution and photographed it instead of stopping it. Or perhaps he couldn't have stopped it. Perhaps the divisions between liberation and revenge, justice and murder, were too blurred in those chaotic days. But he'd kept the evidence, hidden it away, carried it for 75 years. "Why didn't he ever share these?" I asked Ellen. "I think he was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of implicating the soldiers he'd served with. Afraid of the complexity of it all." She paused. "He told me once that the hardest thing about war wasn't the violence. It was watching good people do terrible things and not knowing how to judge them for it." Isabel and I presented our findings to a French historical commission investigating wartime atrocities. They confirmed that Madeleine Roussel had likely been executed without trial in July 1944, one of an estimated 10,000 French civilians killed in extrajudicial violence during and immediately after the liberation. Most of those killings were never investigated. The perpetrators were never prosecuted. The victims were buried in unmarked graves or their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace. Madeleine became a statistic, a name in a registry of the disappeared, until now. "These photographs," Isabel said, "are the only visual evidence we have of what happened to her. They're proof that she existed, that her death wasn't just rumored but real, that she deserves to be remembered as a victim, not a collaborator." I looked again at the original photograph, the soldiers resting, oblivious to the horror unfolding behind them, and I understood what Thomas Garrett had tried to capture. Not a moment of peace, but the terrible coexistence of peace and violence, of liberation and vengeance, of justice and murder, all existing in the same frame, all part of the same war. I returned to the United States with copies of all the photographs and a growing sense that this story needed to be told, but carefully. The ethical questions were overwhelming. Should I publish photographs of a woman moments before her execution? Would doing so honor her memory or exploit her suffering? What responsibility did I have to the families of the soldiers who'd been present, even if they hadn't participated directly? How could I tell this story without reducing Madeleine Roussel to a symbol? I consulted with historians, ethicists, and survivors of wartime violence. Dr. Sarah Klein, a specialist in trauma and memory at Columbia University, helped me understand the stakes. "These photographs are evidence," she said, "not just of what happened to Madeleine, but of the broader context of liberation violence that's been minimized in popular narratives about World War II. We celebrate D-Day and the liberation of France, but we rarely discuss what came after: the score settling, the vigilante justice, the women who were brutalized in the name of purification." But showing her face, showing her final moments. Is complicated, yes, but consider the alternative. Without these photographs, Madeleine remains invisible. Just another name in a list of disappeared persons. The photographs give her humanity back. They force us to see her as real. I decided to move forward, but with clear guidelines. I would blur faces of living persons who could be identified. I would focus on Madeleine's story, not sensationalize her death. And I would try to understand who she was before she became a victim. Isabelle helped me locate Madeleine's surviving family in France. Her niece, Claire Bertrand, now in her 70s, agreed to speak with me. We met at her apartment in Paris, where she kept a small collection of family photographs and documents. My mother rarely spoke about Aunt Madeleine, Claire said, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. The shame was too great. In those years after the war, if your relative had been accused of collaboration, even falsely, you didn't defend them. You stayed silent. You tried to forget. She showed me photographs of Madeleine before the war. A bright-eyed girl graduating from school. A young woman at a cafe with friends. Someone who looked full of life and hope. What happened to her? I asked gently. Claire pulled out a worn folder of documents. After the Germans occupied our region, Madeleine was conscripted to work as a translator at the local kommandantur. She spoke German. She'd studied it in school. The Germans threatened to deport our entire family if she refused. So she went. She had no choice. Was she involved in anything beyond translation? No. She translated documents. Routine administrative things. She hated it. My mother said Madeleine cried every night. She felt trapped, complicit. But what could she do? If she ran, they'd punish the family. If she stayed, she'd be seen as a collaborator. It was an impossible situation that thousands of French civilians faced during the occupation. When the Americans arrived, what happened? Claire's face darkened. Joy at first. Liberation, freedom. But then the accusations started. Someone said Madeleine had been too friendly with the Germans. Someone else said she'd informed on resistance members, which was a lie. My mother was certain it was a lie. But the lie spread. And once you were accused, there was no defense. No trial. Just judgment. Do you know who took her? Local resistance. Men who'd been in hiding during the occupation and emerged after liberation with scores to settle. Some had legitimate grievances against real collaborators. Others just wanted revenge. Madeleine was an easy target. Claire pulled out a letter, yellow with age, written in careful script. This arrived a week after Madeleine disappeared. From a friend who'd been with her when they took her. The friend was too afraid to testify publicly, but she wrote this to my grandmother. I read the letter carefully. Dear Madame Roussel, I must tell you what I saw, though it brings me great pain. They came for Madeleine on July 21st. They accused her of collaboration. She denied it. She begged them to speak with her employers, to verify that she'd only done translation work under duress. They wouldn't listen. They took her to the Leclerc farm. I followed at a distance. I saw Americans camped nearby, but they didn't intervene. The resistance took Madeleine inside. I heard shouting. I heard her crying. Then silence. I waited until dark, but she never came out. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me for not being brave enough to help her. Claire wiped tears from her eyes. My grandmother kept this letter until she died. She never got justice for her daughter. She never even got a body to bury. Madeleine just disappeared, and the family was told to be grateful the investigation stopped with her, that they didn't come for anyone else. And after the war, we tried to clear her name. We petitioned for a review of her case, but the records had been destroyed or never existed. And by the 1950s, no one wanted to reopen those wounds. France was rebuilding, looking forward. They didn't want to revisit the ugly things that happened during liberation. I showed Claire the photographs. She looked at them for a long time, tears streaming down her face. That's her, she whispered, pointing to the figure in the window. That's Aunt Madeleine. I'm sorry these images exist, I said. Don't be. They're proof. Proof she was real. Proof she suffered. Proof she was murdered for something she didn't do. Claire gripped my hand. Tell her story, please. Don't let her be forgotten again. I promised I would. Back in the States, I worked with forensic photo analysts to examine every detail of the original photograph. They identified additional elements I'd missed. In one corner of the frame, partially obscured by shadow, another American soldier stood in the farmhouse doorway. Unlike his comrades outside, he was watching what was happening inside. His posture suggested discomfort, perhaps even objection, but he made no move to intervene. This soldier knew, the analyst said. He was witnessing it. Whether he had the authority or ability to stop it is another question. I tried to identify him through unit records and insignia, but the resolution wasn't high enough. He remained anonymous, one more person who saw and did nothing. I contacted military historians specializing in rules of engagement and wartime conduct. Colonel James Hartley, retired from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, provided context. In July 1944, the situation in France was legally murky, he explained. American forces were liberators, not occupiers. They had limited authority over French civilians. If French resistance forces were conducting their own justice, however brutal, American commanders often took the position that it was internal French business. Even when it involved extrajudicial executions? Officially, no. Unofficially, many commanders looked the other way. They were focused on the military campaign. They didn't want to get involved in French politics, and many genuinely believed that collaborators deserved punishment. But Madeleine Roussel wasn't a collaborator. No, but in those chaotic days, accusations were enough. Proving innocence was nearly impossible. It was a failure of justice on multiple levels. The French resistance who executed her without trial, the American forces who witnessed it and didn't intervene, the post-war authorities who never investigated, and the decades of silence that followed. I spent weeks wrestling with how to tell this story. Every angle felt inadequate. Every framing seemed to miss something essential. Finally, I realized the story wasn't just about Madeleine. It was about all the invisible victims of liberation. The women accused, the scores settled, the violence committed in the name of justice that was never examined or acknowledged. Madeleine's face in that window was a portal into a hidden history, and Thomas Garrett's photographs were evidence that someone, at least, had tried to document the truth, even if he'd lacked the courage to speak it aloud during his lifetime. Now, 75 years later, it was time for that truth to be heard. Normandy, France, July 21st, 1944. Madeleine Roussel woke to the sound of celebration in the village square. The Americans had arrived 3 days earlier, and the streets were still filled with joy. Flags hung from windows. Children chased the soldiers, begging for chocolate and cigarettes. Women who'd hidden for years emerged into daylight, weeping with relief. But Madeleine stayed inside. She knew what was coming. She'd seen it already in other villages. The accusations, the public humiliations, the women dragged through streets with their heads shaved while crowds jeered. She'd worked for the Germans, not by choice. But choice didn't matter now. Only the fact of it mattered. Her mother gripped her hand across the breakfast table. "Stay inside today, don't go out, let them celebrate, let the anger pass." "It won't pass, Maman. Someone will remember, someone will accuse. Then we'll explain. We'll tell them you had no choice." Madeleine wanted to believe that would matter, but she'd heard the stories from neighboring towns. Explanations didn't matter. Excuses didn't matter. If you'd been seen with Germans, if you'd worked in their offices, if you'd spoken their language, you were guilty. The knock came at noon. 3 men stood at the door. Madeleine recognized them, local men who'd disappeared into the resistance during the occupation. One had been in her class at school years ago. "Madeleine Roussel," he said formally. "Yes. You're under arrest for collaboration with the enemy." Her mother pushed forward. "She was forced to work for them. They threatened our family. That's for the tribunal to decide." "What tribunal? Where?" "Come with us, Madeleine. Don't make this difficult." Madeleine's hands shook as she put on her coat. Her mother was crying, begging them to be reasonable, to listen. But they weren't listening. They led her through the street. People stopped celebrating to watch. Someone spat at her. A woman she'd known since childhood turned away. They took her to a truck waiting at the edge of town. Inside were 2 other women, both looking terrified. The truck drove for 15 minutes out of the village, up a hill to an old stone farmhouse. American soldiers were camped nearby. She could see their tents, their vehicles. For a moment she felt hope. Americans meant order. rules, justice. But the truck passed the American camp and stopped at the farmhouse. They pulled the women out roughly. Inside, the farmhouse was dark and cold. Several more men waited. Resistance fighters, all armed. A table had been set up like a makeshift courtroom. A man with a scar across his face sat behind the table. He gestured to Madeleine. Name? Madeleine Roussel. You worked for the Germans at the Kommandantur. I was forced. Yes or no? Yes, but were you paid? A small amount. For food. So you profited from collaboration? I had no choice. They threatened my family. The man leaned forward. Did you translate documents that helped the Germans identify resistance members? No. Never. I only translated administrative forms. Supply requisitions, routine. We have a witness who says you translated interrogation reports. That's not true. Who said that? He didn't answer. The questioning continued for hours. The same accusations repeated in different forms. Madeleine denied everything, but her denials meant nothing. They'd already decided her guilt. Finally, they stopped questioning and conferred quietly among themselves. Madeleine stood with her hands bound, her legs weak, her hope fading. One of the men approached her. The tribunal finds you guilty of collaboration. The sentence is death. Madeleine's vision blurred. No. Please. I didn't. Take her outside. They dragged her and the other women to a back room of the farmhouse. Through the window she could see American soldiers sitting outside, resting, smoking. So close. She wanted to scream to them, to beg for help, but she knew they wouldn't intervene. This was French justice, or what passed for justice now. She stood in that room with the other condemned women, waiting. One of them, younger than Madeleine, sobbed continuously. Another stood perfectly still, as if already dead. Madeleine thought of her mother, of the life she'd imagined before the war, of the small things she'd never do again. Walk through the market, read in the garden, feel sunshine on her face. Outside, someone laughed, an American soldier telling a joke in English. The sound was jarring, so normal, so ordinary. While in this dark room, 3 women waited to die. Leclerc Farm, later. That day, Thomas Garrett had been photographing his unit all morning. He was 23 years old, a photographer's mate assigned to document the liberation for military records and morale purposes. He'd photographed the advance, the battles, the jubilant French civilians welcoming American troops. Now, with his unit resting outside a farmhouse, he wanted to capture something quieter. The exhaustion, the relief, the simple human moment of soldiers sitting in sunshine after days of fighting. He positioned himself to frame 5 of his comrades, sitting against the farmhouse wall. They looked good, tired but relaxed, real. He raised his Rolleiflex and focused. Through the viewfinder, he saw his friends clearly. But in the background, through the farmhouse window, something else caught his attention. A figure, a woman, standing very still. Her hands appeared to be bound. Thomas lowered the camera and looked directly at the window. The woman was looking back at him. Their eyes met for a moment. He saw her mouth move. Help me. Or maybe just a silent prayer. Thomas looked away. One of the soldiers called to him. You taking the picture or not, Garrett? Thomas raised the camera again and pressed the shutter. Click. He moved to get another angle, and that's when he saw more clearly into the farmhouse. The door was partially open. A French man with a rifle stood in the doorway. Behind him, more figures, women with bound hands. Thomas understood immediately what he was seeing. These weren't prisoners of war. These were French civilians being held by French resistance. And whatever was happening inside that farmhouse wasn't official military business. He should have reported it, should have told his commanding officer. Instead, he kept photographing. He moved around the side of the building, out of sight of his unit. Through another window, he could see the women more clearly. 3 of them. Young, terrified. He raised his camera and took another photograph. Then another. He told himself he was documenting, creating evidence, that somehow these photographs would matter later. But part of him knew the truth. He was hiding behind his camera instead of acting. One of the French resistance noticed him and came outside. What are you doing? Just taking pictures of my unit, Thomas said carefully. Go back to your camp, this doesn't concern you. Thomas hesitated. What's happening inside? French business, not American business. Those women, collaborators, they'll be dealt with according to French law. What law? Where's the trial? The man's face hardened. We don't need American interference. Your people didn't live under occupation. You don't understand what these women did. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to demand to see proper documentation, proper authority, but he didn't. He returned to his unit, his camera heavy around his neck. An hour later, he heard gunshots from behind the farmhouse. 3 shots, spaced apart, deliberate. The other soldiers glanced at each other but said nothing. They'd heard gunshots every day for weeks. 3 more barely registered. Thomas stood and walked back toward the farmhouse, compelled by something he couldn't name. He came around the corner and saw them. 3 women lying in the dirt behind the building. Executed. Blood pooling in the dust. The French resistance were already covering the bodies with canvas tarps. Thomas raised his camera before he could think better of it. Through the viewfinder, he saw one woman's face. Young, dark hair, eyes still open, staring at nothing. He took the photograph. Then he lowered the camera, feeling sick. One of the French fighters saw him and approached quickly. "Give me the camera." "No. That film is evidence. Give it to me." Thomas's commanding officer appeared, drawn by the confrontation. "What's going on?" The French fighter explained. "This man photographed an internal French matter. I'm confiscating the evidence." The officer looked at Thomas. "Did you photograph them?" "Yes, sir." A long pause. "Why?" "I don't know, sir. I just did." The officer turned to the French fighter. "Those photographs are American military property. You can request copies through proper channels, but you're not confiscating anything." The Frenchman glared but backed down. Thomas's officer pulled him aside after. "What you saw back there, that's complicated. Those men believe they're serving justice. Maybe they are. Maybe they aren't. But it's not our jurisdiction, you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Develop that film yourself. Don't show it to anyone. And for God's sake, don't ever do something like that again. You want to get yourself killed?" "No, sir." Thomas returned to his tent that night with the undeveloped film in his pack. He should have destroyed it, should have let those images disappear, but he didn't. He developed the film in a makeshift darkroom weeks later, looked at the photographs and felt his stomach turn. The woman in the window, the execution, the terrible ordinariness of his friend sitting in sunshine while death happened 20 feet away. He couldn't make sense of it. Couldn't reconcile liberation with execution, justice with murder, his own inaction with his belief in doing the right thing. So he hid the photographs, put them in an envelope and locked them away, carried them through the rest of the war, brought them home, kept them hidden for 75 years. Sometimes he looked at them late at night alone. The woman's face haunted him, not because he'd taken her photograph, but because that was all he'd done. He'd witnessed her final moments and done nothing but press a button. He told himself he was creating evidence. But evidence for what? For whom? What good was documentation without action? What good was seeing the truth if you couldn't speak it? Those questions followed Thomas Garrett for the rest of his life, and the photographs remained hidden, waiting. Paris, present day. 6 months after I began investigating the photograph, I sat in a conference room at the French Ministry of Defense with Isabelle Moreau, Claire Bertrand, and representatives from the Commission for War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity. On the table between us lay Thomas Garrett's photographs, all of them, displayed in chronological sequence. The soldiers resting outside the farmhouse, the woman in the window, the women being led outside, the execution. A senior historian from the commission, Dr. Antoine Mercier, studied them in silence for several minutes. "These photographs," he said finally, "represent some of the most significant visual evidence we have of extrajudicial killings during the liberation period. We've known these incidents occurred, we have testimony, we have burial records, we have estimates of how many died, but we've never had documentation like this. What can be done now?" I asked. "We can formally acknowledge what happened to Madeleine Roussel. We can add her name to the official registry of victims of liberation violence. We can issue a public statement recognizing that she was wrongfully accused and executed without due process." Claire gripped the edge of the table. "Can you clear her name completely?" Dr. Mercier met her eyes. We can state unequivocally that no evidence exists of her collaboration beyond forced labor. We can acknowledge that she was a victim of the chaos following liberation, but, he hesitated, the men who killed her are long dead. There's no one left to prosecute. No justice in the traditional sense. So she just becomes another statistic with better documentation. No, Dr. Mercier said firmly. She becomes a person, with a name, with a story, with family who remembers her. That's not nothing. The commission agreed to several actions. A formal investigation into Madeleine's case, which would be added to the public archive. A memorial plaque at the site of the Leclerc farmhouse, acknowledging what happened there. An official statement recognizing that thousands of French civilians were killed in extrajudicial violence during liberation, many falsely accused. It wasn't justice, but it was acknowledgement. Claire and I traveled to the site of the Leclerc farm a month later. The building was gone now, demolished decades ago. A modern house stood in its place, inhabited by people who had no idea what had happened on that spot. We stood on the hillside, looking at the view Madeleine would have seen in her final moments. I wish my mother had lived to see this, Claire said. She spent her whole life carrying the shame of her sister's death, believing the accusations even though she knew they were false. That's what they did to families like ours, made us complicit in our own relatives' condemnation. The photographs changed that. Yes, because they show the truth, not the sanitized version, not the heroic liberation narrative, but the messy, violent, complicated truth. She turned to me. Are you going to publish all of them? I'd been wrestling with that question for months. I want to publish the first photograph, the soldiers and the woman in the window. I want to publish your aunt's story, but the execution photograph, I paused. I'm not sure. What do you think? Claire thought for a long moment. I think my aunt deserves dignity in death. I think showing her execution might serve historical purposes, but it also reduces her final moments to spectacle. She looked at me. Use your judgment. But remember, she was a person, not a symbol. Don't let her become just another image of atrocity. I decided to publish the first photograph with the full story, but to describe rather than show the execution, to honor Madeleine's humanity without exploiting her death. The article appeared in a major historical journal 3 months later. The response was overwhelming. Historians praised it as important documentation of a neglected aspect of liberation history. Veterans' families reached out with their own stories of witnessing or hearing about similar incidents. French newspapers covered it extensively, sparking renewed debate about how France remembers the liberation period. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. A man named Robert Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen from the WWII Museum, contacted me through the journal. He was 89 years old, a French-American who'd immigrated to the United States in 1946. I was there, he wrote. I was one of the resistance who took Madeleine Roussel to the Leclerc farm, and I've lived with the guilt of it for 75 years. We spoke by phone the following week. His voice was thin, aged, but clear. I was 19 in 1944, he said. I'd been with the resistance for 2 years. We'd lost friends to German reprisals. We'd seen collaborators betray our networks. When liberation came, we were angry, righteous. We believed we were serving justice. You were one of the men who questioned Madeleine. I was. I believed the accusations at the time. Someone said she'd translated interrogation reports that led to arrests. Someone else said she'd been friendly with German officers. We didn't verify, we didn't investigate properly, we just believed. Did you know she was executed? A long silence. I wasn't there for that. I left before they took her behind the building. But I knew what was going to happen. I knew and I didn't stop it. His voice broke. I was a coward. I told myself we were serving justice. But I knew in my heart it was murder. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And I can't die without saying it aloud. We were wrong. What we did to Madeleine Roussel and women like her was wrong. We called it justice. But it was revenge. And I've carried that knowledge my entire life. Have you told anyone else? No. I left France in 1946 because I couldn't live with what I'd seen and done. I built a life in America. Tried to forget. But you never forget. The faces stay with you. I asked if he'd be willing to give a formal statement to the French Commission. Yes, I want it on record. I want people to know that we weren't heroes in those days. We were just damaged people doing terrible things because the world had become terrible. His testimony was added to Madeleine's file. It corroborated everything we'd discovered and provided the final piece of documentation. Robert Chen died 2 months later. His obituary made no mention of the war or his resistance activities. Just a brief life summarized in ordinary language. But his confession had mattered. It had given Madeleine's story a witness who admitted guilt, rather than defended it. Ellen Garrett Morrison, Thomas Garrett's daughter, attended the memorial dedication at the LeClaire farm site. She brought her father's camera, the same Rolleiflex he'd used to take the photographs. He would have wanted someone from our family to be here, she said, to acknowledge what he witnessed and how he failed to act. To say we're sorry it took this long for the truth to be told. The memorial plaque was simple. In memory of Madeleine Roussel and all victims of extrajudicial violence during the liberation of France, 1944-1945. May their stories be remembered with honesty and compassion. Claire placed flowers at the base, and for a moment on that hillside in Normandy, the past and present converged. A woman who died anonymously 75 years ago was finally acknowledged, her name spoken aloud, her truth recognized. Not justice, perhaps, but witness. And sometimes witness is the only justice the dead receive. Normandy, 1 year later. The photograph hangs now in the National WWII Museum in New Orleans, in an exhibition called Liberation's Shadow, The Hidden Violence of 1944. Beside it, Madeleine's story, the testimony, the documents, the confession. I visited the exhibition on its opening day. Families moved through slowly, reading the placards, studying the images. Some looked uncomfortable. Some argued quietly about what it meant. Some stood in silence. A young woman, perhaps 25, stopped in front of Madeleine's photograph. She stared at the blurred figure in the window for a long time. My grandmother was accused of collaboration, she said to her companion, in a different village. She survived because someone intervened, but she never spoke about it. She carried the shame until she died. Was she guilty? No. She'd worked in a German office as a cleaner. That was enough to accuse her. They moved on, but their conversation stayed with me. How many stories like Madeleine's existed? How many women had been executed, humiliated, erased from history because acknowledging them complicated the narrative of heroic liberation? Thousands, certainly. Most would never be documented. Most would remain invisible. But Madeleine's story was no longer invisible. And perhaps that mattered. I thought about Thomas Garrett, carrying those photographs for 75 years, unable to speak about them, unable to destroy them, unable to reconcile what he'd witnessed with what he'd done. He'd created evidence, but lacked the courage to present it. Until after his death, when someone else could tell the story, he couldn't. I thought about Robert Chen, living with guilt for decades, finally confessing in his final months because silence had become unbearable. I thought about Claire, fighting to clear her aunt's name despite never having met her, motivated purely by family loyalty and a belief that truth mattered. And I thought about the American soldiers in that photograph, sitting in sunshine, exhausted and relieved while 20 feet away women were being prepared for execution. Did they know? Did they care? Could they have stopped it? The questions have no simple answers. War creates impossible situations where good people make terrible choices, where victims and perpetrators exist in the same frame, where liberation and vengeance become indistinguishable. Madeleine Roussel was 22 years old when she died. She'd committed no crime except surviving under occupation in a way that others deemed insufficient or suspicious. She was executed without trial, without defense, without mercy. And for 75 years, her death was invisible, a footnote, a rumor, a family shame, until a photograph surfaced that captured her in her final hours, standing at a window, watching soldiers rest in sunshine, knowing her time was ending. The exhibition will tour for 2 years, visiting museums across the United States and Europe. Thousands of people will see Madeleine's face. Most will forget it within hours, but some will remember. Some will ask questions about their own family histories. Some will wonder what stories remain hidden in their grandparents' attics. And maybe that's enough. On the final wall of the exhibition, a quote is displayed. Some photographs capture more than they intend. They hold truths that the photographer couldn't see or didn't want to acknowledge. They become evidence not just of what happened, but of what we chose to see and what we chose to ignore. Below it, Thomas Garrett's note to himself, written on the back of one photograph: "I documented what I saw. I didn't intervene. I've carried that shame my entire life." And beside that, Madeleine's story, told in simple text. Madeleine Roussel, born 1922, died 1944, falsely accused, unjustly executed, finally remembered. I stood in the exhibition for a long time, watching people move through, watching them pause at Madeleine's photograph, watching them read her story, and I thought about the power of witness. Not heroic witness, not brave intervention, just the act of seeing, of acknowledging, of refusing to let truth disappear into silence. Thomas Garrett had seen. He'd failed to act in the moment, but he'd preserved the evidence, and 75 years later, that evidence spoke. Not justice for Madeleine. She was beyond justice, but recognition, memory, a name restored to a face that had been erased. Sometimes that's all we can offer the dead. To see them, to say their names, to acknowledge that they lived, that they suffered, that they mattered, and to refuse to forget, even when forgetting would be easier, even when remembering hurts, even when the photograph shows us something we'd rather not see.